Welcome to Open Pakistan Education Network. Program types in computer programming. A user accesses an application on a computer, which has three types: a desktop application, a web application, or a mobile app. A desktop application is also known as a fat client or thick client application. An application that runs in a web browser is called a thin client application, or simply a website. Lastly, a mobile app runs in a cell phone and can simply be called an app. Regardless of where a program resides or executes, an application has two components: a front end, also called a GUI or graphical user interface, or a UI or user interface. The other part or component of the application is the back end. The front end comprises of UI elements that the user interacts with. The backend can comprise of business logic in the form of compiled code, the application database to house all the application data, and the API or application programming interface to communicate with third-party data or web services. The development process of an application starts off with a code editor that utilizes a framework and a package manager to produce the program logic. The logic written by the developers is translated into compiled code, from which a deployment package is created. The deployment package allows the application to be copied to multiple deployment machines, each one with the platform that supports the application. Let's look at a few examples of general-purpose desktop applications. If the platform on a deployment machine is Microsoft Windows, and the developer wants to write C#, she can use Visual Studio as the code editor and .NET as the framework. She also has a choice to use NuGet as the package manager. Keep in mind though that NuGet is optional. If a developer wants to deploy a desktop application on an Apple iOS platform, she would need to use the Xcode code editor and the Swift programming language. No package manager or framework is used. Let's look at some examples of general-purpose web applications. To deploy a web application on Windows Server, a developer may use Visual Studio Code as the code editor, and in order to use Python as a programming language, an extension needs to be installed. The Flask or Django web frameworks may also be used, but no package managers. In a similar scenario, a web application on the Windows Server platform with Python as the programming language can also use the PyCharm IDE as the code editor. The framework again can be Flask or Django without a package manager in the mix. If the web application needs to be deployed to the Windows Server platform using Visual Studio Code as the code editor, using the JavaScript programming language, an extension needs to be installed for VS Code. The framework used is Node.js, and the package manager is called NPM or Node Package Manager. Similarly, a web application that needs to be deployed to the Linux platform using JavaScript as the programming language and the Node.js as the web framework, the developer can use the Eclipse IDE code editor with a plugin. The developer can also use Chocolatey as a package manager. If the developer uses the Ruby programming language to develop a web application, she uses the Rails framework using either Visual Studio Code, which is installed on the development machine, or Atom, which is used in a web browser. The web application can be deployed to either Windows Server, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux. The last example of a web application is deployed to Windows Server or Linux using JavaScript as the programming language and Visual Studio Code as the code editor. The developer can use JavaScript frameworks such as AngularJS, React.js, or jQuery. Remember, these frameworks are used to develop the web application front end. The next few slides look at some examples of general-purpose mobile apps. If the developer wants to create a mobile app for an iOS device, namely an iPhone or iPad, she uses Xcode as the code editor, which uses the Swift programming language. A mobile app that needs to be deployed to a Google Android device can use either Java or Kotlin as the programming languages inside the Android Studio code editor. A developer may choose to deploy a mobile app to Google Android, Google Fuchsia, Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux using Dart as the programming language, written in either Visual Studio Code or Dartpad in a web browser. The Dart language uses the Flutter framework, which really is an SDK or software development kit. The developer can also choose to deploy to Google Android or Apple iOS devices using C# written in Visual Studio, and use Xamarin and .NET as programming frameworks. A new framework is covered in the next slide. To develop a desktop application or a mobile app that can be deployed to either Google Android, Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux, a developer can write code in either C# or Python in Microsoft Visual Studio. The new development framework for these applications is .NET MAUI, a name that may change in future. I chose to cover 2 examples of machine learning applications. Let's look at what those are. The first example of a machine learning application is one that can be developed and housed in a web browser running in either Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux. The source code is written in Python using either Visual Studio Code or Jupyter, a web browser-based code editor. The developer can also use the PyPy package manager using the pip command in Python. A machine learning solution can also be developed and deployed as a desktop application on Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux. The programming language used is R, written in RStudio. Within RStudio, the RStudio package manager allows outside data science tools and packages using CRAN, PyPy, and Bioconductor. The last category of examples is game development. A developer can create desktop and mobile applications for a multitude of platforms such as Google Android, Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux. The C# programming language is used inside what is known as a game engine, which in this example is Unity. To model assets or artifacts in the game, the developer uses Blender, and the model can then be imported in the game engine. In a similar example, a game is deployed to Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, or Ubuntu Linux, developed using C++ with the Unreal Game Engine and uses Blender for modeling objects used in the game. In the last example, a custom Roblox game can be deployed to Google Android, Microsoft Windows, or Apple iOS, using Roblox Studio as the game engine, which uses the Lua programming language. In this video, we looked at various application types, their components, and more than a dozen examples of program types that developers can build.